What if I told you that 25 cents could completely change your life forever? That's exactly what happened to me. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why a simple quarter purchase turned into a $10 million legal nightmare that nearly destroyed everything I worked for. But here's the twist. The real enemy wasn't who I expected, and the ending will leave you absolutely speechless. My name is Jake Richardson, and I'm a 34-year-old software engineer from Denver, Colorado. Like most people my age, I was drowning in student loans, barely making ends meet, and dreaming of owning property that seemed forever out of reach. My monthly rent was eating up 60% of my income, and every real estate listing felt like a cruel joke. That's when I stumbled upon something that seemed too good to be true. And trust me, in the world of real estate, if it seems too good to be true, it usually is. But sometimes, just sometimes, lightning strikes. It all started on a rainy Tuesday evening in March. I was mindlessly scrolling through obscure government auction websites, a hobby I'd picked up during the pandemic when I had way too much time on my hands. Most of these auctions were for boring stuff: old office furniture, seized vehicles, or properties with more problems than a reality TV show. But then I saw it. Lot number 4437, a cabin described as distressed property requiring immediate attention, sold as is, no warranties. The starting bid? 25 cents. Now, I know what you're thinking. There had to be a catch, right? Massive back taxes, environmental hazards, or maybe the thing was literally falling into a sinkhole. I spent the next 3 hours researching everything I could about this property. The cabin was located in Pine Ridge Valley, about 2 hours outside Denver. The online satellite images were terrible quality, but I could make out what looked like a small structure surrounded by dense forest. The property records showed it was 2.3 acres, and the last recorded sale was in 1987 for $12,000. Here's where it gets interesting. The cabin had been abandoned for over 15 years after the previous owner, an elderly man named Harold Whitmore, passed away with no heirs. The property had bounced around in legal limbo, accumulating small amounts of back taxes until the county finally decided to auction it off just to get it off their books. The total amount owed? Exactly 25 cents in administrative fees. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, refreshing that auction page every few minutes. As the clock ticked toward the auction end time, I was the only bidder. My hands were literally shaking as I clicked submit on my 25-cent bid. 15 minutes later, I received an email confirmation that I was now the proud owner of a cabin I'd never seen in person. I immediately called in sick to work the next day and drove straight to Pine Ridge Valley. The 2-hour drive felt like the longest journey of my life. Was I about to discover my dream property? Or was I driving toward the biggest mistake I'd ever made? When I finally found the dirt road leading to my new property, marked only by a faded wooden sign that said Whitmore's Retreat, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over my car's engine, and then I saw it. Hidden behind a wall of towering pine trees was the most beautiful log cabin I'd ever seen in my life. This wasn't some rundown shack. This was a genuine handcrafted log home with a wraparound porch, stone chimney, and large windows that perfectly framed the mountain views beyond. The cabin was easily 2,500 square feet, with what looked like a second-story loft area. The logs were weathered but structurally sound, and the craftsmanship was absolutely incredible. I spent the entire day exploring my new property. The interior was like stepping back in time, but in the most charming way possible. Hand-hewn wooden beams, a massive stone fireplace that dominated the main living area, and vintage furniture that looked like it belonged in a luxury mountain resort. Sure, everything needed a deep cleaning and some updates, but the bones of this place were solid gold. The property itself was even more spectacular than the cabin. 2.3 acres of pristine wilderness, with a natural creek running along the back boundary and mountain views that people pay thousands of dollars just to look at for a weekend. I found old trails throughout the property that led to hidden clearings and rock formations that took my breath away. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. As I was exploring the upper loft area, I discovered something that would change everything. Hidden behind a loose floorboard, I found a metal box containing Harold Whitmore's personal documents, property surveys, original construction permits from 1962, and most importantly, geological reports that Harold had commissioned in the 1980s. Those geological reports revealed something incredible. My property was sitting on top of a significant mineral deposit. Not gold or silver, but something even more valuable in today's market. Rare earth elements used in smartphone and electric vehicle batteries. The reports estimated the deposit's value at potentially tens of millions of dollars, but Harold had apparently never pursued mining rights before he passed away. I drove back to Denver that night with my head spinning. I'd bought what I thought was just a cool cabin retreat, but I might have accidentally purchased one of the most valuable pieces of undeveloped land in Colorado. I immediately called my lawyer friend Marcus, who specialized in property law, and scheduled an emergency meeting for the next morning. Marcus reviewed all the documents I'd found, ran additional property searches, and confirmed what I was hoping to hear. I owned the property outright, including all mineral rights. The geological reports were legitimate, and with rare earth element prices skyrocketing, my 25-cent investment could potentially be worth millions. But Marcus also warned me about something I hadn't considered. "Jake," he said, leaning back in his chair with a concerned expression, "properties like this don't stay secret for long. Once word gets out about the potential value here, you're going to have people coming out of the woodwork trying to stake claims. You need to be prepared for challenges to your ownership." His words turned out to be prophetic, but not in the way either of us expected. Over the next few months, I split my time between my day job in Denver and fixing up my cabin. I invested about $15,000 in basic renovations, new plumbing, electrical updates, and structural repairs. Nothing fancy, just making the place livable and safe. Every weekend, I'd drive out to Pine Ridge Valley and work on the cabin, falling more in love with the property each time. The transformation was incredible. What had been an abandoned, forgotten property was becoming a stunning mountain retreat. I posted a few photos on my social media, and friends started asking if they could rent it for weekend getaways. That's when I realized I might have stumbled onto another income opportunity. I listed the cabin on vacation rental platforms, and it was booked solid within weeks. The rental income was amazing, but I was careful not to mention anything about the mineral deposits to guests or on any public platforms. Marcus had advised me to keep that information completely confidential until I decided what to do with it. I was torn between the appeal of steady rental income and the potentially life-changing opportunity of mineral extraction. That's when Pine Ridge Homeowners Association entered my life like a tornado. I never saw coming. I'd been successfully operating my cabin rental for about 8 months when I received a certified letter that would change everything. The return address read, Pine Ridge Valley Homeowners Association, Legal Department. I remember staring at that envelope for several minutes before opening it, knowing instinctively that whatever was inside was going to be bad news. The letter was from Margaret Thornton, HOA president, and it was the most aggressively worded legal document I'd ever received. It claimed that my property had been illegally operating commercial activities in violation of neighborhood covenants, and demanded I cease all rental operations immediately. But that wasn't the worst part. The letter also claimed that my property purchase was invalid because I hadn't received proper approval from the HOA before buying. Here's the thing. I'd never heard of Pine Ridge Valley having an HOA. My property was miles away from any other homes, accessible only by a private dirt road, and I'd never received any HOA documents during the purchase process. I immediately called Marcus, who was as confused as I was. "Jake, there's no record of any HOA associated with your property in any of the documentation we reviewed," Marcus told me. "This sounds like someone trying to intimidate you, but we need to take it seriously. Can you find out more about this organization?" I started researching Pine Ridge Valley Homeowners Association and discovered something disturbing. The HOA had been established just 6 months earlier, right around the time my cabin rentals started getting popular. The founding members were all wealthy Denver residents who owned vacation properties in the general area, and Margaret Thornton was a retired corporate lawyer with a reputation for aggressive legal tactics. But here's what really caught my attention. Public records showed that several HOA board members had been making inquiries about purchasing properties in Pine Ridge Valley, specifically properties with significant acreage and development potential. It was starting to look like this wasn't really about rental violations. Someone had discovered the potential value of my land and was trying to force me out. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, which was held at the community center in the nearest town. Walking into that room felt like entering enemy territory. About 15 people were present, all clearly wealthy, all clearly not happy to see me. Margaret Thornton looked exactly like I'd imagined. Perfectly styled gray hair, expensive clothing, and the kind of cold stare that could freeze a lake in summer. "Mr. Richardson," she said before I'd even sat down. "How thoughtful of you to join us. We were just discussing your situation." The meeting was a complete ambush. Margaret presented what she called evidence that my property had always been subject to HOA covenants, dating back to a 1975 neighborhood development plan. She claimed that Harold Whitmore had been required to join the association, but had failed to do so, making all subsequent property transfers invalid. But here's where Margaret made her first mistake. She was so focused on her legal arguments that she accidentally revealed information she shouldn't have known. During her presentation, she mentioned specific details about my property's mineral potential that weren't in any public records. Details that could only have come from someone who'd accessed Harold's private geological reports. After the meeting, I confronted Margaret directly. "How do you know about the geological surveys?" I asked her in the parking lot. Her face went white for just a moment before she composed herself. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Mr. Richardson, but I suggest you consider our offer to purchase your property for fair market value before this legal situation becomes more complicated." That's when I knew for certain this was all a scam. The HOA wasn't trying to enforce legitimate covenants. They were trying to steal my property after discovering its true value. Over the next several weeks, the legal harassment escalated dramatically. I received multiple cease and desist letters, threats of fines and liens, and even had someone from the HOA show up at my cabin taking photographs and measurements while I wasn't there. They were clearly building some kind of case against me, but Marcus assured me their legal arguments were completely baseless. "Jake, they're hoping to intimidate you into settling or selling," Marcus explained during one of our weekly strategy sessions. "This is a classic case of legal bullying. They're betting that fighting them will cost you more than your property is worth, so you'll just walk away." But they had seriously underestimated my determination. This wasn't just about money anymore, it was about principle. I'd legitimately purchased this property through a legal government auction, and no fake HOA was going to steal it from me. That's when I decided to go on the offensive. I hired a private investigator named Sarah Chen, who specialized in corporate fraud cases. Within 2 weeks, Sarah had uncovered a conspiracy that was far more elaborate than I'd imagined. The Pine Ridge Valley HOA was essentially a front organization created specifically to target my property. Margaret Thornton and 3 other board members were all investors in a rare earth mining company called Mountain Vista Extraction. They'd learned about the mineral deposits on my land through contacts in the geological survey industry and hatched a plan to acquire the property for pennies on the dollar. Their scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. Create a fake HOA, claim my property was subject to their covenants, then use legal harassment to force me into a settlement where I'd sell them the land far below its actual value. If that didn't work, they planned to file liens and legal challenges that would tie up the property for years while they negotiated with me from a position of strength. But Sarah's investigation revealed their fatal flaw. In creating their fake HOA documentation, they'd forged Harold Whitmore's signature on several historical documents. Not only was this fraud, but Harold's signature was on file with the county recorder's office from his original property purchase in 1987. A simple handwriting analysis would prove the forgeries. Armed with this evidence, Marcus and I scheduled a meeting with the district attorney's office. We presented our findings to Assistant District Attorney Robert Kim, who was fascinated by the complexity of the scheme. "This is one of the most elaborate property fraud cases I've seen," Robert told us. "They created an entire fake organization, complete with bylaws and meeting minutes, all to steal your land. The forgery charges alone could result in felony convictions. But before we could move forward with criminal charges, Margaret Thornton made one final, desperate play that almost worked. I arrived at my cabin one Saturday morning to find a surveyor's crew marking property boundaries with bright orange flags. A man in an expensive suit approached me as I got out of my car. "Mr. Richardson? I'm David Walsh from Pine Ridge Development Corporation. I believe there's been some confusion about your property boundaries." David handed me a set of survey documents that claimed my property was actually only 0.8 acres, not the 2.3 acres I thought I owned. According to their survey, the most valuable section of my land, the area where the mineral deposits were located, was actually part of a separate parcel that they'd recently purchased from the county. "This is ridiculous," I told David. "I have the original property description from my purchase, and it clearly shows 2.3 acres. David smiled in that condescending way that immediately made me want to punch him. "I'm afraid there was an error in the original auction listing. The county has acknowledged the mistake and corrected the property boundaries. But don't worry, we're prepared to offer you $50,000 for your 0.8 acres. That's quite a profit on your 25-cent investment." I immediately called Marcus, who rushed out to the property with the original survey documents. What we discovered was another layer of the conspiracy. Pine Ridge Development Corporation was owned by the same investors behind the fake HOA. When their legal harassment didn't work, they'd moved to Plan B, fraudulent property surveys, but they'd made a critical error. The original 1962 property survey that I'd found in Harold's documents included specific landmark references, large rocks, mature trees, and the natural creek boundary that clearly established the 2.3-acre property lines. Their fake survey would have required moving a creek and removing trees that had been growing for over 60 years. Marcus took photographs of every landmark reference, GPS coordinates of the property boundaries, and even brought in our own licensed surveyor to confirm the original measurements. Within 48 hours, we had irrefutable proof that the Pine Ridge Development Corporation's survey was completely fabricated. That's when the story takes its most dramatic turn. Instead of backing down when confronted with evidence of their fraud, Margaret Thornton decided to double down in the most spectacular way possible. I was working on some repairs to the cabin's front porch when 3 black SUVs pulled up my driveway. 8 people in expensive suits got out of those vehicles like they were conducting a military operation. Margaret Thornton stepped forward, carrying a briefcase and wearing the most arrogant expression I'd ever seen. "Mr. Richardson," she announced in a voice loud enough for the entire valley to hear, "you are trespassing on private property. I'm giving you 30 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate these premises." She then handed me a document that claimed to be a court order granting the Pine Ridge Valley HOA immediate possession of my property, pending resolution of boundary disputes. The document looked official, complete with what appeared to be a judge's signature and court seal. But I'd learned to be suspicious of any document these people produced. I immediately called Marcus while Margaret's team started setting up what looked like a temporary command center in my front yard. "Jake, whatever you do, don't leave that property," Marcus told me urgently. "I'm driving out there right now, and I'm bringing the sheriff's department with me. That court order is almost certainly fake." The next 45 minutes were the most tense of my entire life. Margaret's people were taking photographs, making phone calls, and generally acting like they owned the place. I stayed on my front porch, refusing to engage with them, but also making it clear I wasn't going anywhere. When Marcus arrived with 2 sheriff's deputies, the atmosphere immediately shifted. Deputy Sarah Martinez took one look at the supposed court order and immediately identified it as fraudulent. "Ma'am, this document wasn't issued by any court in this county," Deputy Martinez told Margaret. "The case number doesn't exist. The judge's signature is wrong, and this seal hasn't been used by our court system in over 10 years. I need to see identification from everyone in your group." What happened next was like watching a house of cards collapse in real time. Faced with law enforcement scrutiny, Margaret's team started backing toward their vehicles. But Deputy Martinez wasn't finished. "Actually, everyone needs to stay right where you are," she announced. "We have some questions about fraudulent documents and trespassing on private property." That's when Margaret made her final mistake. Instead of cooperating with law enforcement, she became belligerent and threatening. She demanded to speak to the sheriff personally, claimed the deputies were being paid off by me, and actually tried to order them off what she called HOA property. Deputy Martinez arrested Margaret Thornton for fraud, filing false documents, and obstruction of justice. 3 other members of her group were also arrested on various charges. As they were being loaded into police cars, Margaret was still screaming about property rights and corrupt government officials. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, that was just the beginning of the most incredible year of my life. The criminal investigation into the fake HOA scheme uncovered a multi-million-dollar property fraud operation that had been targeting rural properties across 3 states. Margaret Thornton and her associates had used similar tactics to acquire at least 12 other properties, mostly from elderly owners or people who couldn't afford extended legal battles. The district attorney's office was so impressed with the evidence Sarah Chen had gathered that they offered her a consulting contract to help investigate similar schemes. Meanwhile, news of the case started attracting media attention, and that's when things got really interesting. A reporter from the Denver Post contacted me about doing a story on the property fraud case. During our interview, I mentioned that I'd originally bought the cabin for 25 cents at a government auction. The reporter was fascinated by that detail and wanted to know more about the property itself. Without mentioning the mineral deposits, I described the cabin's history, Harold Whitmore's incredible craftsmanship, and the natural beauty of the location. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday Business section with the headline, "From 25 cents to courtroom drama, the property deal that exposed million-dollar fraud." Within hours of the article's publication, my phone was ringing constantly. Real estate agents, property developers, television producers, and even a few celebrities were calling about my cabin. Everyone wanted to see this mysterious property that had caused such an elaborate fraud scheme. That's when I realized the media attention had created an opportunity I never expected. Instead of selling to developers or keeping the cabin as a rental property, I decided to leverage the publicity to maximize its value in a completely different way. I contacted a high-end real estate agent who specialized in luxury mountain properties. Jennifer Walsh had sold some of the most expensive cabins in Colorado and immediately understood the unique appeal of my story. "Jake, you don't just have a beautiful mountain property," Jennifer told me during our first meeting. "You have the most famous cabin in Colorado right now. Everyone wants to see the place that caused criminals to create an entire fake organization just to steal it." Jennifer was right. She arranged for professional photography and video tours that showcased not just the cabin itself, but the incredible story behind it. The marketing campaign emphasized the property's history, Harold Whitmore's craftsmanship, and the natural beauty of the location. We positioned it as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to own a piece of Colorado history. The response was overwhelming. Within the first week, we had inquiries from tech executives, Hollywood producers, professional athletes, and even a few foreign investors. But the most interesting call came from someone I never expected. "Is this Jake Richardson?" the voice on the phone asked. "My name is Robert Whitmore. Harold Whitmore was my grandfather." Robert explained that he'd seen the news coverage about my property and wanted to know more about what I'd discovered in his grandfather's cabin. He lived in California and had never even known his grandfather owned property in Colorado. Their family had lost touch with Harold after Robert's father died in a car accident in 1985. I invited Robert to visit the cabin, and when he arrived the following weekend, his reaction was incredible. He walked through the property like he was seeing a family history he'd never known existed. Harold's personal items, the handcrafted furniture, even the hidden box of documents. It was all a revelation to Robert. "My grandfather always said he had a special project in Colorado," Robert told me as we sat on the front porch watching the sunset. "But our family thought he meant he was just doing some consulting work for mining companies. We had no idea he'd built this incredible place." That conversation changed everything for me. Yes, my property was potentially worth millions because of the mineral deposits and the media attention, but it was also a piece of someone's family history, a testament to Harold Whitmore's incredible craftsmanship and vision. Robert and I worked out an agreement that honored both the property's financial value and its historical significance. He purchased the cabin and 2 acres for $2.8 million, with the understanding that I would retain the 0.3 acres where the most significant mineral deposits were located. But here's the twist that makes this entire story worth telling. During the final property survey before closing, we made one more discovery that changed everything again. The surveyor found something that hadn't been detected in the original geological reports. Hidden beneath what appeared to be a natural rock formation, Harold Whitmore had constructed an underground workshop and storage facility. When we opened it up, we discovered that Harold hadn't just known about the mineral deposits. He'd been quietly extracting and refining rare earth elements for decades. The underground facility contained equipment, processed materials, and detailed records showing that Harold had been operating a small-scale mining operation since the early 1980s. He'd accumulated thousands of pounds of refined rare earth elements, stored in sealed containers and organized with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything else about his property. Conservative estimates valued Harold's processed materials at over $7 million, with current market prices continuing to rise. The discovery explained why Margaret Thornton's group had been so determined to acquire the property. Someone in the mining industry had figured out that Harold's land contained more than just potential deposits. Robert and I split the value of Harold's materials, with the understanding that he would use his portion to establish a foundation preserving mountain craftsmanship traditions that his grandfather had valued so much. My share, combined with the profit from selling the cabin, meant that my 25-cent investment had generated returns of over $10 million, but the most satisfying part of this entire experience was the conclusion of the criminal case against Margaret Thornton and her associates. They were convicted on multiple federal fraud charges and sentenced to significant prison terms. Margaret herself received 8 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay over $2 million in restitution to other victims of their property fraud schemes. The fake Pine Ridge Valley Homeowners Association was officially disbanded, and new regulations were implemented to prevent similar schemes. My case became a textbook example in law schools of how seemingly legitimate organizations can be used to commit sophisticated fraud. Today, I still live in Denver, but I use the money from my cabin sale to invest in legitimate real estate opportunities and help other people navigate property purchases safely. I've become something of an expert on government auctions and rural property rights, and I frequently speak at real estate conferences about protecting yourself from fraud schemes. Robert Whitmore turned Harold's Cabin into a museum and educational center where people can learn about traditional mountain construction techniques and the history of mining in Colorado. The property hosts workshops, retreats, and educational programs that honor Harold's memory while sharing his knowledge with new generations. Looking back on this entire experience, I realized that buying that cabin for 25 cents changed my life in ways I never could have imagined. Not just financially, though the money has certainly provided security I never thought I'd have. More importantly, it taught me lessons about persistence, standing up for what's right, and the importance of thorough research in any major decision. The fake HOA tried to steal my property through intimidation and fraud, but their scheme ultimately backfired spectacularly. Their criminal behavior not only landed them in prison but also generated the media attention that made my property far more valuable than it would have been otherwise. Sometimes, people ask me if I ever suspected that 25-cent cabin would turn into such an incredible opportunity. The honest answer is no. I was just hoping to get a cool weekend retreat for practically nothing. But I've learned that the best opportunities often come disguised as risks that other people are afraid to take. If there's one piece of advice I'd give to anyone considering an unusual investment opportunity, it's this. Do your research, trust your instincts, and don't let other people's fear or greed influence your decisions. That 25-cent cabin taught me that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most incredible rewards. And always read the fine print, especially when someone claims you owe them money or allegiance for property you legitimately own. Because sometimes what looks like a homeowners association is actually just a criminal organization in expensive suits, and the only way to stop them is to fight back with truth, persistence, and occasionally, law enforcement. My 25-cent cabin is now worth over $10 million, but the real value was learning that with enough determination and the right legal help, even regular people can defeat sophisticated fraud schemes and protect what's rightfully theirs. That's a lesson worth more than any amount of money, and it's why I'll never regret taking a chance on what seemed like an impossible deal. Sometimes the best investments are the ones that seem too good to be true, but you'll never know unless you're brave enough to find out.